But please join me in giving a warm welcome to our next presenter, Jasmine Sunny Murphy. Hold on one moment. Sunny Murphy is a science communicator and reporter that specializes in the intersection between Black and Indigenous U.S. histories as they overlap with ecology. She earned a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and plans to complete her Master's of Science in Environmental Policy and Management with American Public University. Sunny, thanks so much for being with us today, and I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Hi, everybody. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited. I've had a fantastic time so far listening to the talks. I think I'm really excited because I think this was the perfect kind of ensemble today, because I think what I'm about to talk about really fits in well with the talk earlier about the Wisconsin wolf situation. And so I'm gonna share my screen real quick before I forget to set myself up before I start talking. Let's see. Oh, let's see if it'll let me do it properly. 1 second, y'all. My testing earlier was right, but now it looks like it will only give me part of my screen, which is not good. One moment. Sorry, everybody.
No worries, take your time.
Sorry. So here's what I'm gonna do. Percent. Yes. Here. Yeah, so I wonder what's happening there. The problem that I'm having is when I go to share, I want to share just part of my screen because I got my notes and I don't want to have everything all cluttered. But for some reason, it's only giving me the option to share the full thing. So pardon me, y'all, but you might see all my notes and stuff, and that might be weird.
No worries at all.
Okay, so let me go to present then. Come on. Okay, I see. Okay, close that down. Okay. On it. Go here. And that looks about right. Okay. So you're gonna see all my notes. Sorry about that, y'all. Does this look okay?
It does.
Okay, so let me put that down. Okay, well, you already heard my intro. Yeah, so I'll just jump right in here into the contents here. So what I have for you today is just kind of a general exploration of what it means to decolonize conservation, what it means that conservation is colonized to begin with, and then we're going to look at two different examples of stakeholders being excluded from conservation. And then we're going to reflect on what it means to decolonize conservation and forge a path forward, really, for us to continue in this work. And the reason that I'm focusing on this term decolonize is because, you know, you've probably heard it as much as I have. And my concern is that it's kind of being thrown around without really a fundamental or substantial understanding of what it means to decolonize of anything, really, and conservation at that. And so what I want to do is kind of help you to understand what it means, first of all, that it's colonized, and with that understanding, you can move forward productively in that work. So why does it matter that we decolonize conservation? So in order to answer this question, we need to first acknowledge that conservation, just like the other panelists have been talking about today, it's driven by people and their behaviors. Now, people are different. They behave differently. They think differently. They have different relationships with the land. And in order to understand their behaviors as it relates to the land, you must first understand those relationships. And with that understanding, you can then ensure better success in your conservation work, because you'll have that fundamental understanding of this is how people are behaving, this is how they're thinking, and this is how we can change their behavior. And because those differences in behaviors and those differences in perspectives, excuse me, my smoke alarm battery has been bad, so you'll probably hear that beeping. Because of those behaviors and different perspectives, all of them can interact with your conservation work in unique ways. And because they can interact and therefore cause different results and influences, that makes those individuals stakeholders. And now a stakeholder is any group or an individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of an organization's purpose. So this means basically you are working to conserve wolves, just like the example that we heard earlier with the Wisconsin wolf events. You have so many different interests there at play, right? You've got your agricultural interests who want to protect livestock. You have your hunters, recreational and professional. You have your pro-wildlife interest groups. You have your political interests. All of those things can come together and affect the success of your conservation work. And Megan Drahim and colleagues wrote in Public Perspectives on the Management of Urban Coyotes, quote, although human-wildlife conflict is sometimes about tangible conflict between humans and wildlife, oftentimes the conflict is actually an outward manifestation of other social issues and basic beliefs about wildlife, meaning what people think and feel, believe about the natural world, including the wildlife within that, all directly influences how they engage with it, and thus how your conservation work needs to play out. And Drahim's studies in particular found, and this is across 3 different papers that I read from this individual, one of which was a dissertation, found that different people and their behaviors are influenced by multiple factors. So one of them being socioeconomic status, whether they own a pet, how they feel about their property, all of these different things. I would add in there religion, because that that influences how you view yourself among non-human life in the natural world. And many people in Drahim's studies would invoke language that was similar to wartime, saying, you know, we have to defend our homeland, defend our property, our way of life, all of these things, talking about wolves and talking about predators. And so these are things that you need to keep in mind as you're thinking about, you know, how do different stakeholders perceive not just wolves, but wolf conservation, because they might see it as a direct affront to their way of life. And this is why Elizabeth Elliott and colleagues in the publication titled Coexisting with Coyotes in an Urban Environment, they say, quote, managing people is crucial to coexistence. And I say that as a direct response, actually, someone brought up in the past, you know, wolf conservation is only about the wolves. And that's just never been true of any conservation work. As long as humans have existed, there has never been such a thing as a human-free or untouched or pristine wildlife. We exist as part of this world. And so in order to have successful conservation work, you must be able to manage and engage with people. You can't take the two apart. And that's why we see right here that stakeholders and stakeholder engagement is one of the very first things you should do when you are planning and implementing conservation work. Their perspectives and experiences should be, as I said, one of the first things that you should consider. And in the 1984 book, and I'll get past all this boring stuff, but I want you to understand that both on a social and a management logistics level, all of this is important. So in the 1984 book, Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach by R.E. Freeman, the author touches on this idea of stakeholder legitimacy, writing, quote, "Stakeholder connotes legitimacy. And while managers may not think that certain groups are legitimate in the sense that their demands on the firm are inappropriate, they had better give legitimacy to these groups in terms of their ability to affect the direction of the firm." And essentially what that's saying is, you know, even if you don't think a certain group, an interest group, a political group, a commercial group, even if you don't think that their perspectives or their input is directly relevant to what you're doing, it is in your best interest as a conservationist to consider those perspectives, because they can, one way or another, influence the success of your work. And just a quick note, that can be through litigation, that can be through social pressure, through commercial means, all types of ways. So this is a stakeholder map. It's presented with the stakeholder theory that now underlies a lot of adaptive management work, which was a bulk of my master's program so far, and was really shaped how I think about a lot of this. It was initially introduced in the context of commercial business, but it's still very relevant to conservation work. And we're going to put the USDA in the middle as we get started, because this is the firm that oversees one of the nation's most prominent, I guess, most well-known conservation organizations and wildlife and natural resources management organizations, called the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, APHIS, Wildlife Services. Now, according to the USDA APHIS Wildlife Services website, they are, this organization is charged with partly being responsible for conservation throughout the United States. Protecting threatened and endangered wildlife and plants from impacts of disease, invasive species, and predators is one focus of the APHIS Wildlife Services program. Wildlife services, threatened and endangered species activities are conducted in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state wildlife management agencies, conservation organizations, private landowners, and others. So that's on their website, and that's just saying that these are all the things that they're responsible for in the scope of conservation and adjacent activities. Okay, so now we're going to jump into what does it mean that conservation is colonized? And this question is actually a perfect opportunity for me to back up and correct myself, because at the beginning of my talk, I did not do my land acknowledgement. I am actually in Buena Vista, Virginia, which is within the lands of the Monacan people. So excuse me for not doing that at the beginning of my talk. So what does it mean that conservation is colonized? Well, this means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I talked to Dr. Madhusudan Kati in an interview, I think like last year. Dr. Kati is a co-author in a paper that talked about really the limitations of Western knowledge systems and gave some steps to overcome them. It's called Decoloniality and Anti-Oppressive Practices for a More Ethical Ecology. And this is how Dr. Kati put it. I grew up in India, and I got my training as an ecologist in India, which is a former colony. And it's taken me a long time to realize how much of the training I've received was rooted in the Western colonial science framework. So in that sense, some of this attempt to decolonize is personal. Many names of species and things like that are named after European people, but also the ideas of what conservation is supposed to be, the separation of people from nature, and the national park model that has caused a lot of displacement of people and active harm. And some of that is internalized now. It's no longer just these colonizers from outside telling us what to do. We've internalized it completely. So in that sense, to me, it hits pretty deeply. I love the point that Dr. Kati brings up there. We're going to talk about the national park model later, but it's the point that I really want you to focus on here is that it's internalized. This is not just an external system that has been working on society and different groups, but it has very much been, in my view, American people in the United States, rather, United States citizens, have been very effectively propagandized for several generations in the way that we think of nature versus society, sort of civilization, and also how we think about how we need to conserve nature. And so, you know, I think that these things have been very deeply entrenched in the way that we think. And so we're going to dive further into that here with these two examples. Now, first example, we're going to look at a bunch of the overarching impacts on Indigenous peoples throughout the United States within the scope of conservation. So where did the exclusion of Indigenous peoples in American conservation begin? This is really hard to say because there's a lot of different ways to talk about this. For our scope, we're going to say that it began the moment that British colonists arrived here. Now, I do want to note that French and Spanish colonists were here far before them. So you could say that it started then. But for now, we're going to focus on the British colonists within the scope of this book called American Canopy, Trees, Forests, and the Making of a Nation by Eric Rutkow. And he talks about how the English age of exploration was largely driven by the fact that the British had depleted a lot of their natural resources. And so they were in search of timber in particular to combat the Spanish Navy. People were actually in England, rather, were actually suffering from timber shortages because they had wiped out their forests essentially. And people were literally freezing to death because they didn't have enough firewood. And so this reality coming from, you know, these settlers coming from a place that had decimated its natural resources, they already had this mindset of fear. And so in their mind, they created this environment where if you wanted to conserve natural resources, if you wanted to conserve natural spaces, then humans had to be checked. Humans couldn't be there anymore because of their own experiences. They then went on and imposed that on other people. And that's why we have this idea of a humanless nature. But that's also why we have this instrumentalist view of nature, meaning, you know, what can I get out of the natural world? How can I extract? And we see that this idea really echoed throughout the generations. We see in this newspaper called Happy Days from the Civilian Conservation Corps, it echoed that kind of settler obsession, and I'll say capitalist obsession really, with the American forests. They write in this newspaper, quote, each fire that burns through them, each insect that destroys them, every disease that despoils them should be considered our enemy. And that bled over into their view, not just of the timber, but of the wildlife that lived within these forests. They viewed it as, this is something for our use. There's another issue of this Happy Days newspaper. This is from 1933, by the way, that talked about the forests as a tree farm. And they specified that, oh, you know, these used to be called forest reserves, but there's nothing reserved about them anymore. Now they are completely and totally for use. And so we see this idea of anything that is threatening our use, our extractive use of these natural lands, is the enemy. And that's where we start seeing this idea of anti-predator coming in. Real quick, we'll go to another example. The settlers passed down their hegemonic ideology and their capitalist ideology throughout generations, and this permeated through Manifest Destiny times. hunters, traders, fur trappers, they would all flood into the West and they wiped out bison and elk. Because they wiped down these species, they did it for multiple reasons: to protect their livestock as they moved into the West, and I'll get to this actually right now, to subjugate the local natives, because as you'll see, or excuse me, I won't actually be able to show this to you, but a reference from Reverend Samuel Parker, who I'll describe as a missionary, in his journal of his exploration of the Oregon Territory, which is modern day Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and most of British Columbia. He wrote of the local natives, quote, "Their habits are wandering and they rely exclusively on the chase for subsistence. It is also important that the Indians settle down and cultivate the soil." You can also see in the Sheridan papers, this is Philip, is his middle name Henry? I might get his name wrong, so I'll just say Philip Sheridan, fought for in the Indian Wars for the US government. And it's clear in his papers that decimating bison and elk was actually a central tactic to subjugate the local native peoples, because they knew how dependent on species like bison they were. And so you see all of these kind of causes coming together and compounding in a way that is already very purely colonialist and very intentionally anti-native, and now creating the problem that we have with wolves and coyotes. You decimate those species, not only do you hurt the local native populations, but you also hurt those native species, those native predator species. And so we're going to come in with our stakeholder map here, and we're going to put these settlers at customers because they are direct beneficiaries of this multi-layered generational settler effort to really shape and ravage the land for extraction, and focus on United States interests. So as we begin to look at federal agencies overseeing conservation and wildlife management here in the US, I want to go back to what Dr. Kati said about Western colonial science framework. We've talked a lot about anthropocentrism today. That's really a core part of this, often kind of underlined by Christian Eurocentric beliefs where humans are sovereign, humans are superior. And so I'll read just a bit of this from a lecture from 1972 on coyotes and sheep. Quote, "Animal damage control has always been an essential element in the protection of human interests. No country, including this one, could have progressed from a primitive stage without such practices, and control has been employed in the United States since the first European settlers arrived. Indian history records some similar activities." So we're already seeing an issue here. For one, there's a clear devaluation and there's a belittling of Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, experience, in the context of natural resource management, and painting European settler practices as superior to that. We see, looking at this language of primitive stage, we had to extract from the land. We had to view the land instrumentally in order to elevate civilization. And, the author right here acknowledges that, sure, Indian history records manipulation of the land, sure, but it's not as effective as the settlers did. We see this kind of warped mentality in the wildlife services directives as well. I know earlier panelists mentioned this too, of how destructive wildlife services is. This organization has been single-handedly responsible for killing millions of coyotes, millions of wolves, and other species along with them, all for the purpose of, elevating this idea of predators bad because they compete with our commercial interests in species like bison, like deer, all of that stuff. So we'll read just a tiny piece of this. Wildlife is a highly dynamic and mobile resource that can cause damage to agriculture and property, pose risk to human health and safety, and affect natural resources. And so you see kind of this idea of only parts of the natural environment, only parts of the natural world are worthy of our protection because this undesirable organism is negatively impacting something that we consider profitable, which is the deer, which is the timber. Now, diving deeper into this, we are looking at the Bureau of Biological Survey directives and field activities. They operated throughout the nation, and they were actually pretty wide reaching. This is just a couple of samples of where they operated. And as you can see, they contracted with hunters and trappers specifically to control populations of wolves, coyotes, and other species. And this is kind of how far reaching they were. And now here's why this is a problem. Now, keep in mind, the Bureau of Biological Survey is actually the direct, or not direct, I think there may have been one or two in between, but a predecessor of the Wildlife Services Agency. This is how widespread they were. And these hunters, trappers, and fur traders that they would contract with were very violently anti-Native. So right here, we see an excerpt from the book, Wolf and Coyote Trapping by A.R. Harding, published in 1909. It says, quote, "The coyote bears the same relation to the wolf family that the Apache Indian does to the human race. It is a belief among some of the Apaches that they turn into coyotes when they depart this life, and nothing will induce one of them to kill a coyote. Like the Indian, he is sneaky and treacherous and full of the devil." That's a little uncomfortable, right? Moving forward, another excerpt here, Corbin's Advice or the Wolf Hunter's Guide by Ben Corbin, published in 1900. Ben Corbin, by the way, was viewed as the best, if not, or excuse me, one of the best, if not the best, wolf hunters in the nation. And he said, quote, "If Jesus did not disdain to call himself the Good Shepherd, why should any man in Dakota not be proud to be called by that name or to be associated as I am with the men who are feeding their flocks on the rich and abundant pastures of this great commonwealth? Largely, my life has been spent in protecting these flocks against the incursions of ravenous beasts of prey. I know it is but a step, and the first step, which counts in the march of civilization. God made the country, but man made the town. And some of these towns are pretty tough, like most of men's work. I cannot believe that Providence intended that these rich lands, broad, well-watered, fertile, and waving with abundant pasturage, close by mountains and valleys, filled with gold and every metal and mineral, should be forever monopolized by wild beasts and savage men." Wow. Goes on to say, "The wolf is the enemy of civilization, and I want to exterminate him. If he eats up the flocks, where are your wool and mutton to come from? And what's the use of a tariff on wool and free trade in wools? I would place the duty higher on both." And for one last, a little more extreme example, he says, "My father hunted redskins with Daniel Boone and counted the notches on his gun barrel, a notch for every scalp, 14 in all." So we see from these excerpts that wolf hunting wasn't just about the sport. It wasn't just about, protecting livestock, even though those were very strong interests. This was an identity. He saw himself as a protector of their way of life. Speaking about Corbin here, Harding saw Native people as treacherous and equated them with a species that he viewed as kind of a pest. And so these are ideological, deeply set identity issues that persist in these places. This guy talks about being a Dakota man, and I'll refer to that in a second, but also in the culture of hunting. And so we're going to put hunters down here, hunters, traders, fur trappers, at trade association and employees here on the stakeholder map. Trade association because they were the ones running the fur trade, and employees because they were contracting with the Bureau of Biological Survey, active participants in conservation. Now, I don't have time to go through this, but I really want to keep this in here because I want you to do some screenshots if you'd like, because this part is about basically understanding that coyotes and wolves, the reason I'm putting coyotes in here is because they have a lot of kind of similar issues in terms of how socially they're viewed. There's also a lot of hybridization going on right now, so we need to think about them together. And historically, settlers actually viewed them as wolves. Coyotes were called prairie wolves. So they're very close in my mind. But yeah, so this right here, along with some, I'll just pass through these letters here. These are from public comment periods on delisting wolves from the endangered species lists. This one right here, I'll have to remember what this one is in particular, but these are just public comments basically relating to wolves. And I want to put this in here because it shows the extent to which there are so many different relationships with wolves, so many different relationships with these species. And these are things that we need to think about when we're, considering how do we reach out to people? How do we build connections? How do we do outreach when we're trying to do our community-based conservation work and we're trying to mitigate human-wildlife conflict? How do we do that? We need to think about all of these different relationships. And so with the history that we just kind of went over, we now look to situations like this, where this report detailed the experience of Robert Gosnell, his nickname was Goose, who previously worked as a state director for USDA APHIS in New Mexico. Gosnell noticed that reports citing wolf kills as justification for the removal of endangered gray wolves, they were unfounded, and he blew the whistle and attempted reform, but he was met with extreme retaliation. He lost his job. He was driven out of the county, I believe. It might just be city, but he was driven out of where he was working because he tried to reform. And A.R. Harding, actually, one of the writers in the book that I just read an excerpt from earlier, mentioned that there was fraud going on even in 1909. And so that's how long this system has been ineffective and driven by just an interest in killing wolves, really. So I really encourage you to read that report. But that's how we get situations like that. This really deeply entrenched identity. And so I want to close this part with a quote from Joy Braun. She, or also known as Eagle Feather Woman of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. She was the leading fighter against the Keystone XL pipeline and a protector of her ancestral sacred Black Hills. And so she says, we've had to fight to even have a seat at the table. We still deal with racism, institutional racism. That's kind of always the elephant in the room. When we all meet, we have to understand that that's there. And there's going to be things on both sides that are going to trigger one another. There is still a very big divide between Indigenous communities and the non-Native communities in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska. These three states, including anywhere up here where we call the far north, has a huge racism problem. And what I want to note here, two things. So Dakota, Ben Corbin talked about being a Dakota man. So that's just something to keep in mind of how past settler culture, frontier culture still permeates in these areas. But also note that Joy Braun said here, the divide between Indigenous communities and non-Native communities. She didn't just say between Indigenous communities and white communities. And I want to point that out because this isn't just a Native, white, Black, white. It's not that kind of thing. This is an everybody issue. There are going to be triggers. Somebody mentioned in response to my last talk that there are still healing to do from, for example, the Buffalo Soldiers, which were Negro soldiers who were fighting with the government after emancipation, and they contributed to placing Natives forcefully onto reservations. On our side as Black Americans, there's still the pain of, recognizing that Native tribes also participated in enslavement of African peoples and African diasporic peoples. So there's like a lot that has to be acknowledged. There's a lot that has to be talked about. And this is not just a, insert people group here versus white problem. Like, that's not what this is. This is an issue that everybody needs to talk about, and everybody needs to acknowledge our full history here in these states. And so we're putting the First Nations here on the government side because tribal councils need to be considered and engaged with as deserving and respected government bodies. And the reason that there's an X here is because the United States government is saying, no, we will not consider you, your life ways, your belief systems in our conservation work. So into this next part, we're going to talk about a little bit as it relates to predator management, predator control, but on a broader sense of how different people groups, with the example of Black Americans, feel about and may engage with conservation as a general practice. So this is right here. The old fur traders always got a Negro, if possible, to negotiate for them with the Indians because of their pacifying effect. They could manage them better with the white men than the white men with less friction. That's according to Colonel James Stevenson, referred to in Black People Who Made the Old West by William Cantz. And Cantz writes right after that, quote, "Scholars have confirmed this judgment made by Colonel Stevenson." Now this is important because this is one of the foundational historical elements that defined settlers' relationships, not only with Native tribes and nations, but also with the species within the context of the fur trade. And remember, the fur trade was directly related to predator control in the States. And so all of these things kind of come together with African diasporic people as the middlemen here. Real quick, the background image here, that's just an illustration of the historical pattern here. Who you're seeing back there is the enslaved person named York. He actually traveled with Lewis and Clark, and he was actually an essential element of them navigating the land and engaging with Native peoples. And so here's just one example of one of those people, one of those African diasporic people who was born into slavery, but later played a critical role in the fur trade and also with negotiating even treaties between the federal government and, in this case, the Chippewa. This is George Bonga. Another example is James Beckworth. George Bonga, as Cantz writes, was a local legend among both red and white men. His frontier skills, command of languages, and ability as a diplomat assured him of friends wherever he went. He was actually a very prominent fur trader and, as I mentioned, negotiated the Chippewa Treaty of 1837, born to an enslaved person and an Ojibwe person, and worked for the American Fur Company. And he actually gave rise to the Bongo Township in Cass County, Minnesota. And so a little bit further into the future, we're going to talk about how Black American stakeholders were left out. And there's kind of a lot here. So we're going to go a little bit quickly because I'm kind of dragging a little bit, but that's okay. So Black Americans suffered relatively little access to natural spaces. Most parks facilities were reserved for use by white Americans, and many of those available to Black citizens were way too far. Many families didn't have a car. There were some serious socioeconomic divides, which still exist to this day. And so a lot of times their only options were Negro parks. Many of these not only were too far, but they were often in disrepair as well. These circles represent the area covered by one or more state parks And above, you'll see the system for whites, whereas below, you're going to see the system that was available to Black people. And a lot of these in those circles, those are actually proposed. So those aren't even like in existence yet. And I'll just quickly note that between the 1930s and the 60s, only about 40 of these sites were accessible to Black Americans, and some of them, half of these were dual use, meaning that white people could use them during a specific time and Black people could use them at another time. And I did say the 60s, many of these parks were not desegregated until the 60s. So that's kind of an element that kept Black people out of these areas. The park system has a very deep, multi-layered history of pain and trauma, really. In the book, The Undying Past of Shenandoah National Park, the author Darwin Lambert writes, quote, "The park part of the Blue Ridge was dominated by the plantation system from about 1740 until the war between the states. German farmers who did most of their own work, manual or mental, with the help of their children, dominated the valley and foothill area. Some of these Germans did have a slave or two, though their farms were seldom plantations by my definition. The plantation system won out over most farmer owners for more than a century." And so here we're kind of seeing, this is one of the historical layers, another historical layer that has given root to generational trauma that keeps some people out. And so this is just, these are just very general examples. I don't claim for this to be 100% accurate. This is just something that I did to kind of visualize for me, because I'm a very visual learner. To kind of represent where the author Darwin Lambert mentioned some of these plantations being, and he lists so many different names. But this right here is one of them, west of the Ridgetop in Augusta. And he lists so many different plantations that were out, not covering this entire area, but in that general area. And then we see here some more areas where plantations were. And you can actually, there are plantations of, oh man, I think it's called the Bell Grove plantation that you can still actually see just explicitly. They don't hide it. So that's something that like might keep people out, is this generational trauma arising from slavery. And so here's another layer with the Civilian Conservation Corps that I mentioned earlier. This group, this organization that was across the nation, employing young men and eventually young women, they essentially built the national parks here and the state parks and stuff, and a lot of the natural spaces that we recreate in. This is from the Happy Days newspaper that I referenced earlier. All of these, this is minstrel shows. And if you don't know what minstrel shows are, this is what made the blackface. This is where all the blackface entertainment kind of came from. And this was a normal part of life in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Even though, we have, some people like to point out like, oh, Black people did help build the parks. They were welcome. It was equal. Not really. This is the culture that kind of underlied the creation of the national park system. And even, the group that they talk about right here in the Booker T. Washington camp, which was the segregated camp for the Negro boys, it was still very condescending, very, what's the word here? Patronizing in how they were engaged. And after that, you have now the very people, so the Civilian Conservation Corps, after they build these national parks, the Black people being part of that, they're then told, no, you can't actually access the entire park. You can't engage with the system that you helped create. You're not allowed, you're not welcome here. And so not only was it out of their reach, but a lot of Black families were just straight up not allowed in certain areas. And if they were not happy with that, too bad, they couldn't just go to another part of the park because they were explicitly rejected there was I can't read the whole passage here because I'm running a little bit out of time, but W.E.B. Du Bois talks about basically the Jim Crow waiting rooms, and Black people would just be humiliated and they would be heckled, and they would be harassed if they had to take public transportation because they didn't have cars when they went to go and try to visit these parks. And under Jim Crow law, that wasn't the only thing. This passage right here talks about how there was the very real threat of lynching. That was a very real potential consequence of violating these Jim Crow laws. And so we see here, quote, in the Racial Etiquette, Racial Customs and Rules of Racial Behavior in the Jim Crow Era by Ronald L.F. Davis. He says, quote, most Southern white Americans who grew up prior to 1954 expected Black Americans to conduct themselves according to well understood rituals of behavior. This racial etiquette governed the actions, manners, attitudes, and words of all Black people when in the presence of whites. To violate this racial etiquette placed one's very life and the lives of one's family at risk. And this was extremely widespread. It was seen as very commonplace, even though there were people who did, condemn these things. It was still seen as very commonplace. People would actually treat these like public events. They would take their families to view them. And this is an uncomfortable past that I think that we need to face, because when people don't acknowledge what has actually happened here and what has kept people out of these systems and out of natural spaces and out of conservation, then we're just led to this situation where we gaslight each other all the time. Oh, it wasn't that bad. Oh, it didn't happen for that long. When you have to engage with these truths head on, then there's no room for that. And so that's what we're going to do right now. This is a threat that Black people faced if they did not want to comply with Jim Crow laws or Black codes. They could not just go to a different part of the national park that they helped build, which was built not only on plantation systems, but also on stolen native lands. They couldn't just go to a different part of that if they wanted to engage in the natural world, because this is the threat that they were faced with. So take a moment to kind of step back for a second and ask yourself, how can a people who has been shut out in such an extreme way over multiple generations, how in the world can they feel welcome in conservation? What we just talked about here, when we talked about Black people not being able to access natural spaces and engage in conservation and go to these national parks because they were so humiliated and because it was so scary, they often wouldn't go. And so white people took that to mean, oh, Black people don't care. And that's where that stereotype kind of came from. Black people don't do that. They don't go outside. They don't hike. They don't do all of these things. So when you now know that history, now you need to think about, how would a people who has been subjected to such generational traumas and violence, how can they feel welcome in conservation? And so now we put the African diaspora within the United States, we put them, I just put them, only the example of the fur traders here, the go-betweens. On the supplier side, and the reason I put them there is because, as I mentioned, they were the middlemen between the natives and the federal government, or between contracted trappers and hunters, but they could really be anywhere, just like a lot of these different peoples here. But they have been told, even though they helped build the park system, even though they were essential to negotiating a lot of that trade that helped control predator relations, populations, they are told, no, you cannot engage. We don't want you here. And I want to throw in really quickly that this isn't just unique to Black and Indigenous peoples. Remember, these are examples that I'm giving, but see these, the settlers over here on the customer side, guess what? They were hurt too. And the people of Appalachia are actually an excellent example of this. They were pushed out by, basically the federal government gave the green light for them to be pushed out of their homes for the sake of building Shenandoah National Park. So now you've got the full circle. You pushed Native people out of their lands for the sake of the settlers. The settlers then wanted they then engaged with, they wanted the natural spaces, right? And so they had Black people, actually, I didn't have time to mention it earlier, but slaves were just one of the many different peoples who were used to build the road systems within the national park over here in Shenandoah. And then that all came full circle later to say, now you got to get out, settlers, because now we want to continue forward in this idea of this humanless nature. So now you have to get out. And in the book, Shenandoah, A Story of Conservation and Betrayal by Sue Eisenfeld, the author wrote of families who are removed. She said, quote, "Some people who left unwillingly refuse to ever partake of the park. Some descendants say they feel horrible when they are there." So even just those people, those settlers' descendants who pushed the native people out, were then full circle told, you can engage, and they felt that they couldn't even interact with the national park because of how they had been wronged. Now think about that over generations for these other groups. And so I'll wrap up really quickly here. Effective governance of natural resources requires that stakeholders feel comfortable and positively engaged in a collaborative effort. How do you ensure that your stakeholders feel comfortable if you, A, don't know what's making them uncomfortable in the first place, B, you refuse to acknowledge what's making them uncomfortable, or C, you neglect to create an environment which would offer comfort in light of their discomforts? And further, how can you invite stakeholders to participate if you don't even seek out or desire knowledge on how to engage with them in these collaborative efforts in your conservation work? I'll just run through these steps to dismantle colonization and conservation super quickly. Step one, basically teach the cultural and socioeconomic pressures that have kept Black and Indigenous people out. Step two, an honest, open review of the extent to which white supremacist influence has shaped the US STEM education system and how we think about conservation. Excuse me. Three, address historic exclusionary hiring and recruitment processes in STEM institutions. Four, reach out to more diverse communities in your wildlife management programs and understand how to do that by acknowledging their history and generational trauma. Five, embrace multiple ways of knowing. And as Dr. Jess Arbach said, in order to shift power dynamics, somebody has to give up power. For the space to become more inclusive, there also has to be less power in the hands of whiteness. And perhaps it's unsurprising that there's going to be some resistance to that. So I thank you. I thank the people who gave those interviews in my past works. Thank you to Speak for Wolves, and you can contact me at these places if you want to kind of work more on uncovering these histories and incorporating that into how you go about your outreach. So, yeah. All right. Let's see. Did y'all have any? Do I even have time for questions?
Yes, you do. And I think Rosie is trying to get back on to ask you questions.
Okay. I actually see two here if you want me to answer those.
Sure. Well, you can do that while we figure out why Rosie is unable to unmute.
Yeah, no problem.
Steph, and I can take over for Rosie. No problem. Hi. So well, one of the questions we have here is, I appreciate how you touch on the concept that I simplify as skin folk don't mean kinfolk, and that decolonizing has so many layers and internalized in each of us to do the work. Intersectionality and restorative justice can only be accomplished when we face the past and come to terms with our place in the white settler dominant culture and how that has translated into environmental conservation. Actually, this isn't a question. This is a plug for your books.
That's good.
So let's see. So if you don't mind, let's see. So you've written a couple of books on coyotes. An Expert Guide to Coyotes 101, Lessons to Learn About, Embrace and Love Coyotes from A to Z. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think we're going to throw some of these links into the chat here.
I did. They're in the chat.
Okay, great, thanks. And then there's also Americans Hate Coyotes,
Yeah.
which sounds inflammatory, but it's not. Okay, and then let's see. I think that was the two, right? We wanted to throw in there. Is that right, Rachel?
Yes, the link I posted lists both of her books.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Okay, here's another question for you. Can we identify the wolves themselves as stakeholders?
Yeah, I was actually, yes, that was something that I was thinking about. I'm looking for the name from this morning's talk. Francisco actually mentioned that. And I was thinking about that because here's kind of how my thinking has changed over the last maybe year or two. So I mentioned the idea of conservation as nature separate from people, a humanless nature, right? And so that kind of comes into this thinking of, if it's not human, then it must be thought about in a different world, a different context. But as you dig deeper into what you actually think about conservation and you think about how have I been trained to think about this, you start to realize that, oh, I'm not actually separate from this world. I'm not separate from this land. I'm not separate from these trees and these squirrels that live by my house, these deer that cross the yard every day. These are my neighbors. And so I say that because you have to be able to view non-human life as just as deserving of consideration as your own in order to view them as a stakeholder. I hope that makes sense, because if you continue to think of things like, oh, this is a wolf and I want to preserve it because it's pretty. I want to preserve it because it will help me to, or no, it'll be there for my children to see in the future, or something like that. That's so anthropocentric and it's so focused on how wolves are pretty to us and our perceptions of wolves. But if you stop to think, no, the wolf is my neighbor. The wolf was here before me. The wolf helped to cultivate this land for me to live here before I was even a thought in the universe's mind, so to speak. Before I, as humanity, even came into existence, the wolf took care of this land. And so, yes, I would absolutely say the wolf can be seen as a stakeholder and needs to be seen as a stakeholder. And along the lines of how I talked about, we tend to view in this very instrumentalist perspective of, how can I extract? What can the natural world do for me? These are resources. And that's not how we should think of these things. I argue that we need to think of these things as having intrinsic value, meaning they have their own interest, they have their own need to survive, their own desire to explore their ancestral lands. So yes, I think that the wolf can be seen as a stakeholder, and I think it must be seen as a stakeholder in order for us to change how we do conservation, how we approach it. That was a little long-winded, but yeah. I see the other one here. Do you see hatred and killings of wolves that we have been witnessing across the northern Rocky Mountain states this year being rooted in white supremacy? So that seems like a straightforward question, but I think it's actually a little complicated, because I even have to correct myself here when I'm thinking about these things, because I want to be careful to acknowledge that I don't think that hunting in general / hunting wolves is exclusively rooted in white supremacy. I think that is a large component of it. However, because we have been so propagandized for generations, as I mentioned, it's no longer just an issue of white supremacy. I think it's also an issue of us perceiving the natural worlds and non-human organisms as separate. I think it's an issue of us seeing them as encroaching on our cities, on our towns. You know, this wolf doesn't belong in my neighborhood. It can enjoy the natural habitat over there. And that is broken thinking. And I think that's a huge contributor, to why we engage with wolves the way that we do, including lethal management. I think that this also gets into agricultural commercial interests, because as I mentioned the report earlier on the individual USDA APHIS in New Mexico who tried to blow the whistle on fraudulent wolf killings. You know, you have that commercial interest as well. You have the political interest. So while I do think that white supremacy and Eurocentrism are at the core, I don't think it is exclusive to that. I hope that makes sense.
Hi, sorry for our technical difficulties.
No worries.
Thank you for that talk. That was fascinating. And I kind of think you answered the question I was about to ask. But it was really like, you know, I'm sure all of us have seen that humans are very reluctant to see ourselves as animals. You know, so what you just said, I believe, answers the question, you know, the idea that we want to see ourselves apart from the natural world. Do you think there's an additional component to that? The fact that we refuse to see ourselves as animals? Is there some more baggage to that?
I think I wouldn't say that there's an additional component, but I think that there are multiple layers that I like, even myself, I'm not even aware of, that contribute to our desire to see ourselves that way. I think we are afraid to give up power as humans, even those of us who don't, because like, even those of us who are kind of on the level of maybe not such an affluent socioeconomic status, we still view ourselves as having some sort of power because we can have a house, because we can have a car, because we can have something that separates and puts a barrier between us and that squirrel, or us and that deer. And there's also an entitlement that comes with that too. Like we see in this in Yellowstone, the constant invasion of space for the bison. Like, we are so entitled to to non-human space and lives, and we would never think to, well, most people would never think to invade another person's space that way. But we do it to non-humans because we see ourselves as above them. And I think that is deeply based in religious backgrounds. I think that's deeply based and like I mentioned, in commercial interests. And I think there's just a personal fear that we have of being able to acknowledge, you know, that I'm an animal. I think that we have been so effectively propagandized that, and to think of ourselves as animals would be seen as self-insulting. And I think we really need to get over that. We seriously need to get over that. But I'm sorry, that's a hard question. I hope I had somewhat answered.
You answered it. Thank you very much. And I do want to give people the opportunity for breaks. I'm just going to ask one more thing. Your source material is amazing. It's just very, very impressive. Do you have links to that somewhere, or are you going to write another book? Or
I am going to write another book, actually. So here's what I'm doing. I am actually adding more. hoping to add more interviews to Americans Hate Coyotes, because I wanted to make that a little easier to read for non-academics, because I realize it's quite dense. It was a bunch of essays, so there's that. But and I want to add different perspectives. So that will be in Americans Hate Coyotes, and then I'm also working on You're Not a Conservationist. That is yet to be have a date or anything like that. I'm just about a third of the way through that. I expect that I'll probably be done with it within the next year. But what I can do is I can put together a full list, and I can, at the website and the email that I had, you can just contact me at one of those, and then I can send a drive of the list or post it on my website or something like that. Yeah, so I'll make that a little easier to track for everybody.
Well, thank you. I am very thankful that you could present today. That was amazing. And I just so appreciate the work that you do. And I want to go read your books now.
Thank you all. This was really great. This is great.